The sea embraces you in its cold grip, while ancient eyes watch from the depths. Darkness swallows light as teeth and tentacles close in on fragile flesh. Nature's perfect killers hunt with patient precision, their hunger older than time. Your screams will drown in water, blood, and mud as you become another story that almost wasn't told. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's attack case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to me, and I need your support, so please subscribe, and it will help me a lot. Click the like button and comment which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Amber Wilson took a deep breath as she gazed at the vast ocean stretching before her. The turquoise waters of the Florida Keys extended to the horizon in a shimmering line that seemed to invite her to explore its mysteries. At 39 years old, she had never had the courage to venture into the sea. Water had always been her enemy, a constant reminder of her body, of the 660 pounds she carried like a prison of flesh. She had arrived at this paradise corner of the American coastline after years of postponing her dreams. Life is too short. Her therapist had told her during their last session before the trip. Your fears are only stealing experiences from you. Those words echoed in her mind as her feet sank into the warm sand. The snorkeling instructor, Mike, waited for her with a smile that couldn't hide his surprise. It wasn't every day that someone of Amber's size requested a shallow diving lesson. They had needed to get specialized equipment, an extra-large flotation vest, and a custom-made wetsuit that had been shipped from Miami. "Don't worry," Mike assured her while adjusting the mask to her face. "The water will support you. It's easier to move here than on land." Amber nodded, unsure. Her body, that enormous mass that had always defined her in the eyes of others, seemed even more exposed under the relentless tropical sun. Several people on the beach observed her with curiosity. She was accustomed to the stares, the whispers, the discomfort her presence generated, but today would be different. Today she wouldn't be the obese woman who could barely walk under her own weight. Today she would be an explorer, an adventurer. The first contact with the water was a shock. It was colder than she expected, but pleasantly refreshing against her perpetually overheated skin. Mike guided her patiently, teaching her to breathe through the snorkel, to stay calm, to let herself be carried by the gentle currents. "We float better with more volume," Mike explained tactfully. "Your body has a greater natural buoyancy than many of my other students." And he was right. To her surprise, Amber felt lighter than she had in decades. The water supported her body, temporarily freeing her from the constant struggle against gravity. It was an almost intoxicating sensation. Beneath the surface, an entirely new world revealed itself. Schools of yellow and blue fish danced among the corals. Anemones undulated with the current, like colorful fingers waving at her. Amber smiled inside her mask, fascinated by the beauty that had been beyond her reach for so long. Mike accompanied her for the first hour, showing her the secrets of the reef, pointing out marine creatures and gently guiding her. Gradually, Amber gained confidence. Her body, always an obstacle on land, moved with unexpected grace in the water. "I think you're ready to explore on your own," Mike told her after confirming she had mastered the basic techniques. "Stay close to the reef. Don't go too far from the shore and return within an hour. I'll be watching from here." The freedom was intoxicating. Without Mike's watchful eye, Amber felt even more daring. She glided over the reef, marveling at each new discovery. An octopus changed color before, her eyes perfectly camouflaging itself against the coral. A pufferfish inflated when she passed too close. It was like being in a nature documentary, but being part of it. She didn't realize how much time had passed or how far she had traveled. The current had carried her gently, and she, absorbed in contemplation, had let herself be drawn along. When she finally raised her head to get her bearings, the shore seemed alarmingly distant. A stab of panic pierced her chest. "Stay calm," she told herself. "I just need to swim back slowly." She tried to maintain her composure as she calculated the distance. It couldn't be more than 1,000 feet, but for someone with her physical condition, it represented a considerable challenge. She began swimming back, but soon discovered that the current that had so kindly carried her away from shore now opposed her return. Fatigue came quickly. Her arms, unaccustomed to sustained exercise, began to burn. Her breathing became labored, fogging up the mask. She stopped to rest, floating on her back as Mike had taught her. That's when she felt it, an almost imperceptible change in the water. A vibration, a presence. Amber turned face down again and looked through the mask. At first she saw nothing but the endless blue of the open ocean. Then a shadow, distant at first, barely distinguishable from the seabed, but it was moving, and it was moving toward her. Her rational mind knew what it was, even before the shape defined itself. A shark. Big, very big. The stories of attacks she had obsessively read before the trip, as a masochistic form of preparation, paraded through her mind. Don't panic, she reminded herself, though her heart was already racing. Sharks rarely attack humans. We are not their natural prey. But there were other stories. Stories of cases where sharks confused swimmers with seals, stories of incidents in murky waters, and although the water here was crystal clear, Amber knew that her silhouette seen from below with her wide circumference might look like an appetizing seal to the eyes of a predator. The shark kept approaching. Now she could see it was a great white, the most feared of the seas. Its pale grey body glided with terrifying elegance. It must have measured at least 16 feet, a killing machine perfected by millions of years of evolution. The instructions, in case of spotting a shark that she had memorized, crowded her mind. Stay calm. Don't make sudden movements. Don't swim away quickly, as this could trigger the chase instinct. If the shark showed aggression, make eye contact. Sharks respect hierarchy and perceive direct eye contact as a sign of dominance. Amber tried to follow all these recommendations at once. She breathed deeply through the snorkel, forcing herself to remain on the surface instead of frantically kicking toward the distant shore. She turned to face the shark, keeping her eyes fixed on those of the animal, two bottomless black pools that evaluated her with an ancestral coldness. The shark began to swim in circles around her, getting closer each time. Amber remembered another recommendation: appear large. She extended her arms and legs, forming an X with her body, using her size as an advantage for the first time. Her volume, always a source of shame, could now be her salvation. In an almost mechanical movement, her right hand sought the small diving knife that Mike had insisted she carry strapped to her leg. "Just in case you get tangled in seaweed," he had said. They both knew it was a precaution against something much more dangerous. The shark came so close that Amber could distinguish the scars on its skin, marks of past battles with other predators, or perhaps with boats. Its dorsal fin cut through the water like a dagger just a few yards away, and then, without warning, the shark changed direction. In an instant, its circular trajectory became a straight line directly toward her. The mouth began to open, revealing rows of triangular teeth designed to tear flesh. Amber had no time to think. Her body reacted out of pure survival instinct. In the second that the shark was within her reach, she plunged the knife with all her strength into the point she knew was most sensitive, the tip of the snout, full of sensory receptors. The water around her turned red. The shark thrashed violently, more surprised than injured, and quickly moved away. Amber didn't wait to see if it would return. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she began swimming toward the shore, each stroke an act of pure will. Her lungs burned. Her arms felt like lead. The flotation vest, designed to keep her afloat but not to facilitate rapid movement, now seemed a hindrance. But fear was a more powerful engine than any physical limitation. Every few seconds, she turned her head to check if the shark had returned. The blood in the water could attract it again, this time more aggressively, or it could attract others. She didn't allow herself to consider that possibility. There was only the next movement, the next stroke, the next yard gained toward safety. The coast seemed to approach with painful slowness. Amber began to scream for help, but the snorkel distorted her voice, and she doubted anyone could hear her at that distance. She continued swimming, driven by a primal terror that overcame any fatigue. When finally the tips of her feet touched sand, Amber almost wept with relief, but she wasn't safe yet. The shallow waters were still shark territory. She dragged herself toward the beach with desperation, the water growing increasingly shallow around her massive body. Finally, exhausted and panting, she collapsed on the wet sand, out of reach of the waves. Only then did she allow herself to look back, toward the vast blue that had almost become her tomb. The immensity of the ocean stared back, indifferent to her drama, eternal and mysterious as always. Somewhere beneath that seemingly peaceful surface, the shark continued its ancestral patrol, perhaps with a new scar to tell about. Amber closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against the hot sand. She was alive. Despite all odds, despite her body, despite the most perfect predator of the ocean, she was alive. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The adrenaline was still pumping through Amber Wilson's body as she tried to drag her 660 pounds of body mass out of reach of the waves. The great white shark, that prehistoric beast that had almost turned her into its lunch, might still be lurking in deeper waters, but Amber couldn't take any chances. Each inch she advanced on the wet sand was a victory against death. The muscles in her arms, unaccustomed to such effort, burned, as if they were on fire. Her legs, usually unable to support her for more than a few minutes, now moved with superhuman determination. The body's ability to surpass its limits in the face of imminent death was something Amber had never experienced. When she finally reached the dry area of the beach, she collapsed on the hot sand, her chest rising and falling in ragged, painful breaths. The midday sun beat down mercilessly on her exposed skin, but the heat was comforting compared to the deadly cold of the ocean and what it hid. It was then that she noticed the sharp pain in her right thigh. Looking down, she saw with horror that her wetsuit was torn. Through the torn black fabric, a deep cut was visible, extending from the middle of her thigh to almost her knee. The sand beneath her was beginning to turn red. "Help!" she tried to shout, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. The effort of swimming for her life had consumed every last drop of her energy. "Please, someone!" From the moment she had plunged her knife into the shark's snout, she hadn't been fully aware that the animal had managed to attack her. Perhaps it had been during one of those eternal seconds when she had turned to check if the beast was following her, or maybe when her feet first touched the sandy bottom. Terror and adrenaline had masked the pain, but now it manifested with full force. Blood flowed with alarming speed. Amber, seized with panic, pressed both hands against the wound, but her thick, trembling fingers could barely cover the extent of the cut. Blood seeped between her fingers, hot and thick. A wave of dizziness overcame her. Was this how it would end? Survive the deadliest predator in the ocean only to bleed out on the shore? The irony was cruel. All her life she had fought against her body, against the pounds that imprisoned her, against a society that judged her for her appearance. And now that she had finally found the courage to defy her fears, to experience the freedom that the ocean had momentarily offered, death would come to claim her anyway. "Oh my God, she's injured!" A distant voice penetrated the fog that was beginning to cover her mind. Blurry figures appeared in her field of vision. Worried faces multiplied around her. "We need a tourniquet! Quick!" A young man knelt beside her. He wore the red and yellow uniform of the beach lifeguards. His firm hands moved hers away and applied direct pressure to the wound with expert movements. "My name is Carlos Vega. I'm a lifeguard," he told her in a calm but firm voice. "You've suffered a shark attack, but you're going to be okay. We're calling an ambulance." Amber noticed someone placing something under her head. A rolled-up towel, perhaps. Other hands held hers, comforting her. The stabbing pain in her leg was still there, but the presence of Carlos and the others provided an anchor to reality. "The shark," she began, her voice barely audible. "Don't worry about that now," replied Carlos as he skillfully tied a piece of cloth above the wound. Amber recognized that he was improvising a tourniquet. "Focus on breathing. Inhale through your nose, exhale through your mouth. That's it." Despite Carlos's training, Amber could detect the concern in his eyes. The wound must be serious. With her weight and physical condition, complications were a real threat. Each beat of her heart pumped more blood out of her body. "I'm cold," murmured Amber, although the thermometer must have read over 90 degrees. Carlos took off his shirt and covered her with it, then gestured to the curious onlookers who were beginning to gather. "I need more towels and blankets if anyone has any." People reacted quickly. Amber observed everything as if through a veil, increasingly distant. Faces became blurrier, voices more muffled. Somewhere in her mind, she knew she was going into shock. The blood loss was taking its toll. "Amber, stay with me." Carlos's voice became more urgent. How did he know her name? Perhaps she had told him and didn't remember. "The ambulance is on its way. You have to hold on." Amber tried to nod, but her body no longer responded to her commands. It was strange how, after an entire lifetime feeling that her body was too much, it now seemed to dissolve, become ethereal. "My instructor," she managed to articulate, suddenly remembering Mike. "He should know." "We'll find him," promised Carlos, though they both knew that wasn't the priority now. The sound of sirens penetrated the haze of her consciousness. The ambulance had arrived. Everything happened very quickly then. Professional paramedics took over from Carlos. Technical voices discussed blood pressure, blood loss, vital signs. Words like hypovolemia and hemorrhagic shock floated around her. The biggest challenge was transferring her to the stretcher. Her weight required more personnel than usual. Amber, even in her semi-conscious state, felt the familiar pang of shame. Even on the brink of death, her body continued to be an obstacle, a complication. "On the count of 3, ordered one of the paramedics. 1, 2, 3. She felt them lift her with effort. Someone cursed under their breath. The movement sent a wave of unbearable pain from her injured leg that momentarily returned her to full consciousness. "It hurts," she cried, tears running down her sun-reddened cheeks. "I know, I'm sorry," responded a female paramedic with short hair. "We're going to give you something for the pain right away." They injected her in the arm. Within seconds, a comforting warmth began to spread through her body. The edges of the world softened. The pain was still there, but now it seemed to belong to someone else, to another body. The interior of the ambulance was cramped. The paramedics worked with precise movements, connecting monitors, inserting IVs, applying more pressure to the wound that continued to bleed. "It's a deep laceration," she heard someone say. "It has affected several important vessels. She'll need immediate surgery." "The pressure is dropping," warned another, 90/60 and falling. "Increase the flow of the IV. We need more volume." Amber floated in a state of semi-consciousness, trapped between acute terror and a strange calm. Fragments of thoughts paraded through her mind. Had she closed the door to her hotel room? Who would take care of her cat if she died? Why had she never had the courage to tell her mother she loved her? "Amber, we're arriving at the hospital." The paramedic's voice momentarily anchored her. "You've lost a lot of blood, but we're doing everything possible. You're very strong. You've survived a great white shark. That's something very few people can say." A glimmer of pride made its way through the fog of her consciousness. Yes, she had survived. She, Amber Wilson, the woman who couldn't climb a flight of stairs without getting out of breath, had faced the most feared marine predator and had lived to tell about it. "Don't let this be in vain," she managed to articulate, though she wasn't sure if the words had actually left her mouth or had only resonated in her head. The ambulance stopped with a jolt. The rear doors swung open, revealing more medical personnel waiting. The bright sunlight gave way to the cold, clinical illumination of the hospital as they rapidly transferred her. 39-year-old woman, approximately 660 pounds, shark attack victim, reported one of the paramedics as they ran through the corridors. Deep laceration in the right thigh with significant arterial and venous damage. Estimated blood loss of 1.5 liters. Blood pressure 85/55 and falling. We've administered 2 liters of saline solution and 5 milligrams of morphine. Amber could barely keep up with the information. Her world had been reduced to flashes of fluorescent lights passing over her head and the constant beeping of the monitors. They entered a frantic room. More hands worked on her, cutting away the remains of her wetsuit, connecting more equipment, preparing her for surgery. "Blood type," demanded an authoritative voice. "O negative," someone responded, checking her documentation. "We need at least 4 units, possibly more. Her weight will complicate the anesthesia dosage. Call Dr. Sanders, we need a vascular specialist here right now." A face appeared above her, a middle-aged woman with kind but worried eyes. "Amber, I'm Dr. Ramirez. We're going to take you to surgery. You've suffered significant damage to the blood vessels in your leg. We'll do everything possible to repair them and stop the bleeding. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Amber tried to nod, but the movement was almost imperceptible. "Good, now we're going to put you to sleep. When you wake up, it will all be over." An oxygen mask covered her face. They asked her to count backward from 10. 10, 9, 8. Amber thought about the shark, about its black, expressionless eyes, about the perfect way its body glided through the water, about the sharp teeth that had torn her flesh. A predator perfected by millions of years of evolution. 7, 6. She thought about her own body, imperfect, limited, the object of mockery and prejudice, and yet that same body, with all its limitations, had found the strength to fight, to survive. 5, 4. The drugs were beginning to take effect. The world moved further and further away. One last thought crossed her mind before sinking into darkness. If she survived this, nothing would ever be the same. Not her, not her relationship with her body, not her way of facing life. 3, 2, and then only darkness. The luminous embrace of death. Jason Parker checked his diving equipment for the 3rd time as the boat rocked gently on the dark waters of the Hawaiian deep. The night sky stretched above him like a black velvet canopy, sprinkled with stars, reflecting on the calm sea. The humid heat stuck his t-shirt to his skin, but soon the cool water would envelop him. "Are you sure you want to do this at night?" asked Kikoa, the local captain he had hired to bring him to this remote location off the coast of Kauai. "The Manayakalani jellies are more active after dark. That's why we call them death blossoms. They're beautiful but deadly." Jason adjusted the high-definition underwater camera, verifying that the special lighting worked correctly. This equipment, valued at over $20,000, was his tool to capture what no other documentarian had achieved before: close-up images of the most venomous bioluminescent jellyfish on the planet during their nocturnal reproductive ritual. "That's precisely why we're here," he replied with a smile that couldn't hide his nervousness. National Geographic didn't send me from New York to photograph colorful fish. At 42, Jason Parker had built a solid reputation as one of the world's best underwater photographers. His specialty was dangerous creatures: sharks, sea snakes, venomous octopuses. But the Manaiakalani jellyfish represented an unprecedented challenge. Discovered just 5 years ago in this remote archipelago, these jellyfish possessed a neurotoxin so potent that a single tentacle could paralyze an adult human within minutes. "Your protective suit should resist contact with the tentacles," said Lucas, his assistant and diving companion, a young marine biologist from the University of Hawaii. "But remember to maintain the safety distance we agreed on. Don't get closer than 6 feet, no matter how tempting the shot." Jason nodded. Though they both knew that once underwater, with the opportunity to capture the perfect image in front of him, precautions often took a back seat. It was that instinct, that willingness to risk everything for a unique photograph that had built his career, and also what had left scars all over his body: a moray eel bite in the Caribbean, a brush with a venomous stingray in Australia, a too-close encounter with a hammerhead shark in the Galapagos. 45 minutes, Lucas reminded, as Jason put on his oxygen tank. "Not a minute more. And we'll maintain constant communication by radio." The preparation ritual continued in silence. Special reinforced neoprene suit, Kevlar gloves, full face mask with integrated communication system. Nothing was left to chance when diving with the ocean's most venomous creatures. Finally, with a last adjustment to his equipment, Jason sat on the edge of the boat, holding the camera firmly against his chest. "Impress them in New York," Lucas said with a tense smile. Jason responded with the universal diver's gesture, joining his thumb and index finger in a circle. "All good." Then, with a fluid movement, he fell backward, submerging into the dark waters with a splash that seemed to swallow the silence of the night. The underwater world welcomed him with its cold, wet embrace. His eyes took a few seconds to adapt to the darkness, illuminated only by the powerful underwater flashlight attached to his camera. The beam of light cut through the blackness like a scalpel, revealing suspended particles that danced like dust. In a sunbeam. "Communications check," Lucas said through the radio system. "I hear you perfectly," Jason replied as he descended slowly, controlling his buoyancy with precision. "Acceptable visibility, about 30 feet. No signs yet of our luminous friends." He continued descending until reaching the planned depth, 65 feet. According to his research and information from local fishermen, this was the level where the Manaiakalani jellyfish congregated for their night dance, a bioluminescent spectacle that very few had witnessed and no one had managed to document adequately. "Maintaining position at 65 feet, he reported. "Gentle current toward the northwest. Water temperature 75 degrees. The minutes passed and anxiety began to grow inside him. What if the jellyfish didn't appear tonight? What if the reports were exaggerated? The expedition had cost a fortune, and National Geographic expected results. And then, almost as if responding to his doubts, he saw it, a faint blue light pulsating, in the distance like an underwater star, then another and another. Within seconds, dozens of luminous points began to appear in the darkness, advancing slowly toward him, rocked by the gentle current. "I see them," he murmured, his voice broken with emotion. They're beautiful." "Distance?" Lucas asked in a professional tone, but Jason could detect the underlying tension. "About 50 feet and approaching. I'm going to turn on the ultraviolet lights." He pressed a button on his camera, and the special LEDs emitted their light invisible to the human eye. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. The jellyfish responded to the ultraviolet stimulus by intensifying their natural bioluminescence, transforming from simple blue points into complex luminous structures that pulsed with hypnotic patterns. "My God," whispered Jason, beginning to capture images frantically. "They're reacting to the UV light exactly as Tanaka's study predicted. It's as if they're communicating with each other." The fuel. Jellyfish continued approaching, now about 30 feet away. He could clearly distinguish their morphology: translucent domes that glowed with an ethereal blue, tentacles that extended several yards and emitted pulses of light that traveled from the base to the tips, creating the illusion of electric streams. Flowing in the darkness, Jason, maintained the distance, warned Lucas. "Remember the protocol." I know," he responded automatically, though he was already calculating how to get a little closer without entering the danger zone. He needed a close-up of those luminous patterns, something that would show the complexity of their visual nervous system. The jellyfish now moved in formation, creating what seemed like an underwater ballet choreographed with millimetric precision. Jason had never seen anything similar in his 20 years of career. Each movement, each pulse of light seemed to have a purpose, as if they were executing an ancestral ritual of which humans had no knowledge. "They're congregating," he reported, while continuing to shoot with his camera. "I think we're witnessing the beginning of their mating ritual. The synchronization of the light pulses matches exactly with the fisherman's descriptions." Almost without realizing it, Jason gradually moved closer. 26 feet, 23, 20. The temptation to capture the perfect detail was too strong. His rational mind screamed at him to maintain the distance, but his photographer's instinct had taken control. "Jason, your GPS signal indicates you're getting too close." Lucas's voice now sounded clearly alarmed. "Just a little closer," he murmured, almost to himself. "I need to capture the complete neural pattern. It's the key to understanding their communication." 16 feet. The luminous pulses had intensified, as if the jellyfish were aware of his presence, as if the dance were now for him. The beauty was almost painful, hypnotic. That's when the unthinkable happened. An underwater current, one of those treacherous cross-currents that appear without warning in archipelagic waters, suddenly pushed him forward and downward. In an instant, Jason found himself in the middle of the jellyfish swarm. The panic was immediate and overwhelming. He tried to back up, but the current continued pushing him. The jellyfish, disturbed by his intrusion, began to move erratically, their luminous pulsations now frantic, almost aggressive. "Emergency!" he managed to shout into his microphone. "I'm in the swarm. Repeat, I'm in the swarm. Drop the ballast. And ascend." Lucas's voice sounded distant, as if coming from another world. "Now, Jason." His fingers desperately sought the release mechanism for the ballast belt, but it was already too late. He felt the first contact, as an intense burning on the nape of his neck, right where the suit joined with the mask. One of the tentacles had found the small exposed space. The pain was instantaneous, like a hot iron marking his skin, but what was truly terrifying was what followed. Within seconds, a sensation of numbness began to spread from the point of contact, running down his spine like liquid mercury. They've touched me," he managed to articulate, his voice already slurred. "By the effect of the venom and neurotoxin active, I can't feel the left side. Stay calm." Lucas's voice now sounded desperate. "I'm descending to help you. Try to stay conscious. Breathe slowly." But Jason knew the odds weren't in his favor. He had exhaustively studied the venom of these jellyfish before the expedition. The paralysis would gradually extend, affecting the extremities first, then the intercostal muscles, finally the diaphragm. Death by asphyxiation would occur in less than 15 minutes without medical intervention. The most terrifying thing was that he would remain conscious throughout the process. The neurotoxin didn't affect the brain or consciousness, only the peripheral nervous system. He would feel how his body stopped responding, how oxygen was depleted in his lungs while his mind remained perfectly lucid. With horror, he saw another tentacle wrap around his right arm. The protective suit prevented direct contact with the skin, but the pressure was unmistakable. They were surrounding him, and then he understood: the ultraviolet light. Preliminary studies had suggested that the Manayakalani jellyfish interpreted certain UV frequencies as threat signals. His specialized equipment, designed to stimulate their bioluminescence, had made them aggressive. "Lucas," he managed to say, while struggling to stay afloat, his legs increasingly numb. Yamamoto's counter-analysis. He was right. They're active predators, not opportunistic. Even on the brink of death, the scientist in him continued observing, analyzing. It was almost comical. More tentacles wrapped around his body. The suit resisted, but some found the weak points: the wrists, the ankles, the junction between the mask and neck. Each new contact sent another wave of venom into his system. With a superhuman effort, Jason managed to raise the camera with his right arm, the only one still partially responding to his commands. If he was going to die here, he would at least document the process for science, so others could learn, so his death would have some meaning. The luminous tentacles now created a pattern around his body, a cage of light that pulsed with almost musical rhythms. They were beautiful, fascinating. Even as they killed him, Jason pressed the shutter again and again, capturing his own execution in high definition. "I'm 30 feet from you," Lucas's voice cut through the haze that was beginning to cloud his mind. "I can see you. Hold on, Jason. Don't give up." But they both knew the truth. Lucas couldn't get close without risking suffering the same fate. And even if he reached him, what could he really do? The venom was already in his system, spreading with each beat of his heart. "The C camera," Jason managed to articulate, his lips increasingly numb. "So save the camera. The images are important." His lungs were beginning to feel rigid, as if they were filled with cement instead of air. Each breath required a conscious and exhausting effort. He didn't have much time left. The last thing he saw clearly was Lucas's horrified expression, visible through his mask, as he maintained a prudent distance, helpless before the scene unfolding in front of him. And all around, enveloping both the victim and the witness, the continuous spectacle of the Manaiakalani jellyfish, whose luminous pulses seemed to have synchronized in an almost funeral rhythm, as if they were celebrating their victory over the intruder. "I'm sorry," were the last words he managed to transmit before his finger, in a final act of professional will, pressed the shutter one last time, immortalizing his own embrace with death. The swamp's bite. Sarah Thompson watched as dark clouds swirled menacingly over the endless expanse of Black Bayou. The reptile specialist biologist adjusted her binoculars, scrutinizing the surface of the muddy water in search of any sign of movement. In her 15 years studying alligators, she had never seen such a primitive and isolated ecosystem as this forgotten corner of Louisiana. "We should head back. The storm's coming in fast," warned Marcus, the local guide who had brought her to this remote stretch of swamp. His sun-weathered face showed genuine concern as he looked at the sky. "The gators get more active with the rain, more unpredictable." Sarah nodded distractedly, not taking her eyes from the binoculars. At 36, she had built her academic reputation by defying precisely these kinds of warnings. Her colleagues at the University of Florida called her the Reptile Whisperer for her extraordinary ability to get close to the most aggressive crocodiles and alligators. What they saw as recklessness, she considered informed respect. She knew these animals better than many humans. "Just half an hour more," she responded, finally detecting what she was looking for, the unmistakable silhouette of an adult bull. Alligator sliding silently among the reeds. "Look, Marcus, it's huge. Probably the alpha male of this area." Marcus narrowed his eyes but didn't share her enthusiasm. "The locals call it Old Devour. They say it's killed 6 people in the last few years." "Please, Doctor, the light is fading and the storm." Lightning illuminated the sky, followed almost immediately by deafening thunder that seemed to shake the entire swamp. Fat drops began to fall, creating small craters on the water's surface. "All right," Sarah finally conceded, storing the binoculars in her waterproof backpack. "But we'll return tomorrow at dawn. I need to document the territorial behavior of this specimen." The small wooden boat advanced slowly through the labyrinth of cypress trees. Darkness fell rapidly, intensified by the storm that now unleashed its fury. The rain struck like needles against her skin, and the wind made the cypresses sway threateningly, their twisted roots emerging from the water like skeletal fingers trying to catch them. "You know these swamps well, right?" Sarah asked suddenly, aware of how disorienting the landscape became in these conditions. Marcus nodded as he expertly maneuvered the boat between 2 fallen trunks. "I grew up hunting in these bayous, but even I avoid this area after nightfall." "Because of Old Devour?" Sarah asked with a smile that tried to hide her growing unease. "For many things," Marcus replied enigmatically. "There are places where nature still rules, Doctor, where we are unwelcome visitors." Sarah was about to respond when a dull thud shook the boat. Both staggered, grabbing the edges to maintain balance. "What was that?" she exclaimed. "A submerged log, maybe," Marcus responded, though his tone wasn't convincing. He tried to start the small outboard motor, which had failed with the impact, pulling repeatedly on the starter cord without success. "We're stuck," he finally stated, releasing the cord in frustration. "Other cypress roots have trapped us." The rain intensified, turning the world into a gray curtain that limited visibility to just a few yards. Sarah turned on her waterproof flashlight, directing the beam of light toward the side of the boat. Indeed, they were entangled in a dense knot of roots and underwater vegetation, a perfect natural trap. "We'll have to push," she said, removing her waterproof jacket. "If we move toward that clearing, we might free ourselves." "No," Marcus stopped her firmly, grabbing her arm. "Don't get in the water. Not here." Something in his voice made her shiver. It wasn't the superstitious tone that some guides adopted to impress tourists. It was genuine fear. "Marcus, if we don't free the boat, we'll spend the night here. The storm is getting worse, and we're miles from camp." The guide seemed to be debating internally, looking alternately at Sarah and the dark water surrounding them. Finally, he pulled out a machete from its sheath. "I'll do it," he said with resignation. "You stay in the boat and keep the light pointed where I'm working." Sarah nodded, directing the flashlight beam toward the roots as Marcus leaned over the edge, using the machete to cut the aquatic vines that imprisoned the vessel. The work was slow and tedious. Each cut freed barely a few inches, and the rain made the machete handle slip in his hands. "Almost got it," murmured Marcus, after several minutes of effort. "Just a bit more," and the rest of his sentence was drowned by a bestial roar that emerged from the darkness, a primeval sound that Sarah recognized instantly, though she had never heard it with such intensity, the territorial bellow of an adult male alligator. Everything happened in slow motion. The water's surface exploded next to the boat, revealing a scaly mass over 15 feet long that emerged like an infernal apparition. The jaw, wider than a man's torso, opened to reveal rows of yellowish teeth. In a fluid movement, the colossal reptile lunged at Marcus, closing its jaws around his extended arm with tremendous force. Marcus's scream echoed through the swamp, mixing with the roar of the beast and the rumble of thunder. Sarah was paralyzed with horror as she watched how the alligator, with a single violent twist of its body, tore Marcus from the boat and dragged him under the muddy water. "Marcus!" screamed Sarah, instinctively extending her hand toward the place where the man had disappeared. The surface bubbled violently, the water tinged with a dark red that the rain couldn't dilute. The boat, partially freed from the roots by Marcus's effort and destabilized by the attack, began to spin out of control. Sarah desperately clung to the sides as the vessel hit against the cypresses. In a violent sway, she felt herself losing balance and falling into the fetid water. The swampy cold hit her like a fist, stealing her breath. Her feet didn't touch bottom, and the weight of her field boots pulled her down. She kicked frantically, fighting to stay afloat while looking for something to grab onto. Her fingers found a cypress root, and she grabbed it with the strength of desperation. The boat had drifted several yards away, rocked by the current created by the torrential rain, and somewhere nearby, invisible in the darkness, old Devour continued with his macabre feast. Sarah knew too much about alligators to harbor false hopes. Marcus was dead. The characteristic death roll, that maneuver in which the reptile violently spins its body to dismember the prey, was infallible. And now she was in the water, converted into the next potential target. With cautious movements, she began to propel herself using the cypress roots, advancing inch by inch toward the boat. The rain made visibility difficult, but her flashlight miraculously continued working, tied to her belt and partially submerged. Halfway there, she felt something brush against her leg, something large and scaly. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but years of training in risk situations prevailed. She remained perfectly still, barely breathing as the huge body of the alligator passed beneath her, brushing her leg as a warning, like a predator playing with its prey before attacking. Sarah had studied this behavior. American alligators, unlike many of their cousins, were strategic hunters. They didn't always attack immediately. Sometimes they stalked, studied, waited for the moment of greatest vulnerability. When she felt the animal momentarily move away, she resumed her advance toward the boat, each movement calculated to minimize ripples in the water. She was barely 6 feet from the vessel when she saw it. The alligator had turned around and was heading directly toward her, its huge head cutting through the water like a living torpedo. There was no time to think. There was nowhere to escape. In an act born of pure desperation and scientific knowledge, Sarah plunged both thumbs into the alligator's eyes when it opened its jaws to attack her. The animal's roar of pain made the water vibrate around her. The beast thrashed violently, its tail hitting the water with enough force to create a wave that pushed Sarah backward. Taking advantage of the reptile's moment of confusion, she propelled herself with all her strength toward the boat, managing to grab the edge. She tried to climb in, but a searing pain in her right leg tore a scream from her. Looking down, she found a grotesque spectacle. Her torn pants revealed a deep wound that ran from her thigh to her knee, where the alligator's teeth had managed to graze her during her defensive maneuver. Blood flowed profusely, mixing with the swampy water. Sarah knew that the hemorrhage would attract not only Old Devour, but any other predator for miles around. With a superhuman effort, she managed to drag herself into the boat, collapsing on the wooden bottom as the rain continued to fall mercilessly. The pain was unbearable, but the survival instinct stronger. With trembling fingers, she removed her belt and tightened it around her thigh, improvising a rudimentary tourniquet. Then she tore part of her shirt to press against the wound, trying to contain the bleeding. The boat continued to drift, occasionally hitting against the cypresses. Sarah knew she was in a race against time. The blood loss, exposure to the elements, contaminated swamp waters infiltrating her open wound. Each minute that passed diminished her chances of survival. With one last effort, she reached for the emergency radio she kept in her waterproof backpack. The device, designed for extreme conditions, was her only hope of contacting the base camp. "Mayday, mayday," she whispered in a weak voice, pressing the transmission button. "This is Dr. Thompson. Unknown position in east sector of Black Bayou. Alligator attack, guide deceased, severe injury, need immediate extraction." Only static responded to her call. Was the storm interfering with the signal, or was she simply too far away for anyone to hear her? The alligator hit the bottom of the boat, almost as if it understood what she was doing and wanted to sabotage it. The vessel rocked dangerously, threatening to capsize. Sarah clung to the sides, aware that if she fell back into the water, she wouldn't have a second chance. "This can't end like this," she murmured to herself, her face contorted with pain and determination. Not after all she had survived, all she had achieved in her life. Not at the jaws of the very creature to which she had dedicated her career. With renewed resolution, she searched her backpack for anything she could use as a weapon. Her scientific equipment wasn't designed for combat, but previous emergencies had taught her to improvise. Her dissection kit contained a surgical scalpel made of stainless steel, not much against 15 feet of reptilian muscle, but it gave her something more than bare hands. The alligator hit the boat again, this time with enough force for one of the bottom boards to creak threateningly. Sarah knew the vessel wouldn't resist this siege much longer. She needed to reach solid ground, or at least something resembling it. Through the curtain of rain, she thought she distinguished a more solid formation among the cypresses. It wasn't exactly dry land, but rather a kind of islet formed by interlaced roots and accumulated sediment. If she could get there, she would at least have a surface to stand on, something more defensible than the disintegrating boat beneath her. Using the paddle that miraculously remained on board, she began to propel the boat toward the islet. Each movement sent stabs of pain from her injured leg, and the blood loss was beginning to take its toll in the form of dizziness and blurred vision. Come on," she encouraged herself with each stroke. The alligator seemed to have momentarily retreated, perhaps disconcerted by the injury to its eyes or simply reorganizing for another attack. When the boat finally hit against the islet, Sarah wasted no time. She dragged herself out of the vessel, each movement torture for her mangled leg, and propelled herself onto the tangle of roots and mud. It wasn't the solid ground she had hoped for, more like a kind of soggy vegetable mattress, but at least it elevated her a few inches above the water level. She had barely managed to settle when she saw the alligator's silhouette emerging again, its huge body sliding toward the abandoned boat. With a powerful blow of its tail, the reptile overturned the vessel, as if taking revenge on the object that had protected its prey. Sarah watched with horror as her backpack, with the radio and most of her equipment, fell into the water and sank rapidly. She only retained what she carried on her, the scalpel in her hand, the flashlight on her belt, and the minimal medical supplies she kept in her pockets. The storm began to abate slightly, allowing her better visibility of her surroundings. What she saw wasn't encouraging. The islet was small, barely 10 feet, in diameter, and completely surrounded by the swampy waters where Old Devour stalked her. The base camp was several miles away, and without a radio, no one would know she was in trouble until she didn't return the next day. If she made it to the next day. The alligator swam in circles around the islet, its patience infinite, its strategy clear. It could wait all night if necessary. She, with her open wound and blood loss, didn't have that luxury. Sarah tightened the tourniquet, aware that she couldn't keep it indefinitely without risking tissue necrosis. Infection was practically inevitable in these conditions. "So this is how it ends," she murmured, a bitter smile appearing on her lips as she contemplated the ironic symmetry of the situation. The scientist devoured by the object of her study, the observer turned prey. But something inside her rebelled against this ending. The same determination that had taken her from the suburbs of Chicago to becoming a world authority on reptiles. The same tenacity that had allowed her to overcome prejudices in a male-dominated field. That inner strength refused to surrender. "Not today," she whispered, gripping the scalpel with renewed determination as she watched the alligator that continued patrolling her small island, waiting for fatigue or weakness to force her to make a mistake. "Today will not be my last day in this swamp." The rain continued falling, softer now, and the tropical night enveloped the bayou in a cloak of almost absolute darkness. Only the weak light of her flashlight and the alligator's shining eyes, reflecting that beam like two demonic embers, broke through the darkness. The battle of wills had barely begun, and although the odds were overwhelmingly against her, Sarah Thompson prepared for the longest night of her life, determined to see one more dawn, to survive to tell her story and honor Marcus's memory, whose involuntary sacrifice had given her this chance to fight. Old Devourer and she, predator and prey, engaged in an ancestral dance of survival in the heart of Black Bayou, a duel that only one of them would survive. The scars that remained. The conference room at the Grand Hyatt buzzed with activity. Journalists, scientists, and curious onlookers settled into the rows of seats as the lights gradually dimmed. On the main screen appeared the title, Predators, Encounters at the Edge of Death, accompanied by three striking silhouettes: a great white shark, a jellyfish, and an alligator. Amber Wilson took a deep breath, adjusting her right leg prosthesis under her long dress. 2 years had passed since her encounter with the great white shark off the Florida Keys, and although time had healed many of her physical wounds, the emotional scars remained as fresh as the first day. "Are you ready for this?" asked Jason Parker from his wheelchair. His face, partially disfigured by scars that formed patterns similar to the tentacles of the jellyfish that had almost ended his life, showed a tense but determined smile. "As ready as one can be to relive the worst day of your life in front of 500 people, Amber responded with a nervous laugh. Sarah Thompson joined them, leaning on her cane. The absence of her right leg below the knee was evident, even under her elegantly cut pants. "Remember why we're doing this," Sarah said with the firm voice that characterized her. "Our stories can save lives." The three survivors exchanged looks of mutual recognition, a silent language that only those who have looked death in the eyes can truly understand. They had met a year ago, during a symposium on wild animal attacks, and had formed an instant bond. Three people from completely different backgrounds, united by the shared experience of having survived the planet's deadliest predators. "The book is already in its 3rd edition, commented Jason, pointing to a stack of copies on a nearby table. The cover showed an artistic composition of the three predators that had forever changed their lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced a voice through the speakers, "please welcome our special guests, Amber Wilson, Jason Parker, and Sarah Thompson, authors of Predators, Encounters at the Edge of Death." Applause resonated as the three survivors advanced toward the stage. Amber walked with a slight limp, Jason was pushed by an assistant, and Sarah advanced slowly, supported by her cane. However, there was an undeniable dignity in their movements, a strength that transcended their physical limitations. Once on stage, they took seats facing the expectant audience. The moderator, a well-known nature documentary journalist, welcomed them before addressing the audience. "Today, we have the honor of hearing 3 extraordinary survival stories. 3 people who faced the deadliest predators on our planet and lived to tell about it. We'll begin with Amber Wilson, who in 2023 survived a great white shark attack off the Florida Keys." Amber leaned toward the microphone, aware of the gazes that traveled over her body. Before, those looks would have paralyzed her with shame. Her obesity had always been her prison, the definition by which the world judged her. Now, however, the looks had another meaning. They saw her as a survivor, a fighter, someone who had defied the odds. "I never thought my first attempt at snorkeling would end with the loss of my leg," she began, and absolute silence fell over the audience. "Throughout my life, my weight, 660 pounds back then, had been my biggest battle. Ironically, it was that same body, so despised by me and by society, that found the strength to fight against a predator that has evolved over millions of years to kill." Amber related her story with an eloquence that contrasted with the horror of the events. She described the sensation of freedom in the water, the moment she saw the approaching shadow, the paralyzing terror, and then the mental clarity that allowed her to defend herself. She spoke of the long recovery, the numerous surgeries, the battle against infection that finally led to amputation. "But the most important thing I lost that day wasn't my leg," she concluded. "It was fear, the fear of living, the fear of trying, the fear of being seen. The shark took a part of me but gave me back something much more valuable, my will." The applause was deafening. Amber noticed that many people in the audience were wiping away tears. It wasn't pity she saw in their eyes, but admiration, respect, and even inspiration. "Amber not only survived," the moderator resumed when the applause died down, "but transformed her experience into a mission. Since her recovery, She has lost over 330 pounds and has become an activist for both shark conservation and body acceptance. Her program, Stronger Than Fears, has helped hundreds of people with morbid obesity reconnect with their bodies through adapted physical activity. Amber smiled, thinking of the long road traveled, the physical therapy sessions that became regular exercise, nutrition that went from being an enemy to an ally, the body that began to transform not out of shame, but out of respect for its own strength. Now, continued the moderator, we'll hear the story of Jason Parker, the renowned underwater photographer who survived a deadly encounter with Manaiakalani jellyfish off the coast of Kauai, Hawaii. Jason adjusted the microphone to his height. His hands, covered with scars similar to burns, trembled slightly. The neurological damage caused by the jellyfish neurotoxin had left permanent sequelae. "We photographers are seekers of beauty," he began in a raspy voice. Supreme irony that it was the most hypnotic beauty I had ever seen that almost killed me. His account transported the audience to the dark depths of the Hawaiian Ocean, where the bioluminescent dance of the venomous jellyfish became a deadly trap. He described with scientific precision and poetic emotivity how the tentacles began to paralyze him, how his mind remained lucid while his body stopped responding. "My colleague Lucas risked his own life to rescue me," he explained. "He pulled me from the water when I had already lost control of most of my body. The doctors said I was technically dead for 2 minutes and 13 seconds. He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle on the audience. "The neurotoxin permanently damaged my peripheral nervous system. I can't walk. My hands constantly tremble. I have episodes of temporary paralysis. But the camera I held until the last moment captured images that have revolutionized our understanding of the Manaiakalani jellyfish." On the screen behind him appeared impressive photographs, translucent jellyfish emitting pulses of blue light in complex patterns, tentacles forming intricate luminous networks, the deadly ballet of apparently simple but devastatingly lethal creatures. These images, he pointed out with pride, led to the development of the first effective anti-venom against the toxin of these jellyfish. "The beauty that almost killed me now saves lives." Again, applause filled the room. Jason, unable to stand, nodded his head in gratitude. "Jason founded the Conscious Ocean Initiative," added the moderator, "which educates photographers and divers about the risks of marine fauna. His documentary, Lethal Light, won the Best Scientific Documentary Award at the Tokyo Nature Film Festival." When the applause died down, the moderator turned to Sarah. "Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Sarah Thompson, a biologist specializing in reptiles, who survived a brutal alligator attack in the swamps of Black Bayou, Louisiana." Sarah stood up, leaning on her cane. Unlike Amber and Jason, her face showed few emotions. Her eyes, however, reflected an intensity that immediately captured everyone's attention. "I wasn't the victim of an attack," she began, surprising the audience. "I was witness to a predator doing exactly what millions of years of evolution have taught it to do. The real victim was Marcus, my guide, who died trying to protect me." Her voice broke slightly at the mention of Marcus, the only moment of vulnerability she allowed herself. Then, with clinical precision, she related the night of terror in the swamp, the storm, the stuck boat, the sudden appearance of the enormous alligator, Marcus's instant death, her own desperate struggle to survive. "I spent 17 hours on an islet of cypress roots, bleeding, hypothermic, fighting against the infection that was already beginning to invade my wound. The alligator, which I have come to deeply respect, patiently waited all that time, knowing that eventually exhaustion would force me to make a mistake." She described how she used her scientific knowledge to survive, how she managed to keep the reptile at bay, using her flashlight to disorient it, how she improvised a second tourniquet when the first failed, how she fought against sleep knowing that falling asleep would mean death. At dawn, when the rescue team finally found me, the alligator was still there, vigilant. It wasn't malice that motivated its behavior, but pure instinct. I can't hate it for being what it is. The audience listened in absolute silence, captivated by the tale of extreme survival. I lost my leg below the knee, but gained a deeper understanding of what it means to share the planet with perfect predators. We are not the owners of this world. We are visitors in territories that these animals have dominated for millions of years before our appearance. When Sarah finished her story, the applause was different, more reflective, more contained, but equally respectful. "Dr. Thompson now directs the Coexistence Foundation," informed the moderator, "dedicated to the conservation of crocodile and alligator habitats, promoting safe coexistence between humans and reptiles." Her work has helped reduce alligator attacks by 60% in the communities where she implements her programs. The moderator then invited the audience to ask questions. A young student was the first to raise his hand. Have you ever considered that? It might have been better not to survive given the permanent sequelae you suffered. An uncomfortable silence descended over the room. Amber, Jason, and Sarah exchanged glances. A silent dialogue among those who had confronted that same question countless times in the solitude of recovery. It was Amber who responded first. Each morning when I put on my prosthesis, I remember the price I paid for a moment of courage in the water. But I also remember that the same body that lost a leg found the strength to survive. I wouldn't trade that certainty for anything. Jason nodded before adding, life from this chair isn't what I'd imagined. The tremor in my hands prevents me from doing what I loved most, photographing. But I've learned to direct other photographers to see through their eyes, to teach them to capture beauty without falling into the trap I fell into. There are different ways of being alive. Sarah was the last to speak, her voice firm and clear. The question assumes that a life with physical limitations is worth less than a life without them. I reject that premise. The leg I lost reminds me every day of the fragility of our existence and the responsibility we have to protect even those who can harm us. Another hand was raised. An older woman asked, what do your three experiences have in common? What shared lesson can we learn? The three survivors were silent for a moment, reflecting. Respect, Sarah finally responded. Respect for these predators that aren't monsters, but creatures perfectly adapted to their environment. Respect for nature that doesn't bend to our wishes. And respect for ourselves, for our capacity to survive when all odds are against us. Jason added, and humility. The humility to recognize that with all our technology and knowledge, we remain vulnerable to forces that have existed long before us. Amber completed, but above all, I believe our stories speak of transformation. The three of us were physically transformed, that's obvious, but the real transformation occurred inside, in how we see ourselves, in how we understand our place in the world. After the question session, while signing copies of their book, Amber observed the long line of people waiting. Some were obviously fans of survival stories, others academics interested in their respective fields, but many, and this deeply moved her, were people with their own visible and invisible scars, seeking inspiration from those who had survived the unimaginable. Do you think we're romanticizing trauma? She asked quietly to Sarah, who was signing a book next to her. Sarah reflected for a moment before responding. We don't romanticize trauma. We bear witness to human resilience. There's a difference. Jason, listening to the conversation, added, our scars, visible and invisible, are neither medals of honor nor marks of shame. They are simply maps of where we've been. Amber nodded, understanding. As she signed another book, she realized that the title they had chosen, Predators, Encounters at the Edge of Death, was actually inadequate. It wasn't about the predators, that almost killed them, but about the people they had become after surviving. Perhaps the real title should have been Survivors, Lives Beyond the Edge. Because in the end, their stories didn't end at that terrible moment of encounter with death, but truly began there, in the difficult and brave act of continuing to live, of rebuilding, of finding purpose in pain and meaning in survival. And, as the three continued sharing their experiences with a world eager to listen, their scars, both visible and invisible, continued telling stories of devastation, but also of an indomitable will to live that not even the most perfect of predators could extinguish.